Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome to Money Sense. Your host this morning is myself, Simon Caudry. I am delighted to be joined by two guests this morning, Ethan Russo and Simon Ecclesfield. Ethan is a board-certified neurologist, psychopharmacology researcher, and medical director of Pitex. He has also been involved in clinical trials involving cannabis, is an author of 7 books on the industry, and the former chairman of the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicines. Simon is a former equity trader with a number of years trading stocks in New York and London, and we're delighted that both of them are joining us in the studio this morning. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us, and Ethan, thank you very much for dialing in at a very early hour from the west coast of the US.
Well, you're most welcome.
And good morning, Simon.
Good morning.
Ethan, hopefully I got your titles right there. I was nervous about mispronouncing a few of those words, and apologies if I did. So let me just turn the conversation over to yourself. What I want to talk about this morning is the cannabis industry and what it is, why it's important, and then in the second half of the show, we're going to come on to some discussion items with respect to investment opportunities. Now, as I read your title and the audience were listening to it, I think it's fair to say you know your stuff when it comes to this industry. So perhaps you could just give us some background as to what the cannabis industry is. What is cannabis scientifically? That sort of background, so we have some context to this conversation.
Very good. Well, cannabis sativa, or cultivated cannabis, is an old world plant that is now found around the globe, and it's been used as medicine from time immemorial. It is only in recent decades that cannabis has been a forbidden drug. Now it's coming back into the mainstream, and as you're aware, has been legalized for medical use and occasionally for recreational use in many countries around the globe and various states in the United States. This is on the basis of a great deal of both basic science work done in animals and test tubes in clinical trials where it's actually used under controlled conditions in patients with various conditions. Your listeners may be interested to know that one cannabis-based medicine called Sativex is approved in 29 countries for treatment of spasticity, muscle tightness in multiple sclerosis. And another cannabis-based medicine, primarily based on an extract of cannabidiol, a non-intoxicating cannabinoid from the cannabis plant, is expected to be approved for treatment of severe epilepsies even in the United States later this year. So things are really changing with respect to the acceptance of cannabis as medicine, and there are many reasons behind that we can get into.
Well, what is the chemistry? You alluded to it. What is the chemistry of cannabis? Is it part of the same family as other painkillers or pain-relieving medicines that we hear about and we would take when we go to the hospital?
Right. Well, it's actually quite distinct. Cannabis works in treating pain specifically because it relates to a system we have in our bodies. This is going to require a little explanation, but it's called the endocannabinoid system, or the endogenous cannabinoid system, meaning cannabinoid system within our bodies. That is designed to regulate a lot of other bodily functions. So it's a physiological regulator designed to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is a fancy word for saying with balance in systems. So if we have a system that is overactive, the endocannabinoid system will tend to bring it back down into balance. On the other hand, if the system is underactive, it'll bring the activity back up to where it needs to be. So we have various systems in our body that mediate pain. People are probably more familiar with opioids. There is an endogenous opioid system that works in parallel with this endocannabinoid system. We also have anti-inflammatory painkillers that work through inflammatory pathways These are regulated by things called the prostaglandins, and aspirin and ibuprofen and drugs like that would work there. So the endocannabinoid system is complementary to these other systems, and this is one reason we often end up with multiple drugs working on different pathways in order to try to treat a complex medical problem.
Well, what you've explained there seems to me, and I apologize if I put this into my own words, and to correct me if I'm wrong, but you've described a system whereby there are 3 or 4 different ways that drugs can potentially help relieve pain in humans. Different systems that are affected.
Others.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is many of these were discovered through plants. The prostaglandin system was discovered because of our knowledge of willow bark and then aspirin. The opioid system, of course, was studied from the standpoint of morphine from the opium poppy. And then there's an additional system called the endovanilloid system that's based on capsaicin, the caustic ingredient in chili peppers. So it really highlights the fact that throughout human history, plants have been our medicine. It's only been recently that we've had synthetic development of drugs to try and tap into these systems.
Well,
now, to go back to an earlier question, cannabis is what's known as a botanical agent, meaning that it has a complex chemistry. There are many ingredients in cannabis that work together in what we call. So it's not just a matter of the most familiar component, tetrahydrocannabinol or THC, but additionally, what I mentioned before, cannabidiol, CBD, which is a painkiller and anti-inflammatory in its own right, and has the benefit of counteracting some of the side effects of THC. So it counteracts panic and rapid heart rate that can be encountered as side effects from too much THC.
Well, now when I hear you talk about this, what strikes me is that all these various mechanisms by which humans can use to manage pain, most of these others have been legalized for medicinal use for decades in many cases, or centuries, I suppose, in some respects. Why then did cannabis and its derivations, why are those only now being talked about as being medically useful? Why are the conversations starting today? Or I'm sure you've been talking about it for long, but why only today are we actually starting to see it being used?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid this is all a byproduct of prohibition. In the United States, for example, there was a time in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal and cannabis was legal. So those kinds of things can change. There was a vilification of cannabis that was never really based on its true dangers or having anything to do with its science. And with the explosion of recreational use starting in the United States in the 1960s, slowly over the decades, attitudes have changed. And it's come to be known to many people that cannabis has great medical utility. And particularly with proper breeding techniques, we can make cannabis better and safer and reduce those risks. But to be quite honest and frank about the situation, cannabis as medicine is much safer than most conventional drugs that are used for these serious conditions.
And now, I don't want to sort of suggest that you're saying that on behalf. You are a representative, you have been a representative of the international cannabinoid industry. Would that statement also be said by the vast majority of general practitioners that we might go to see as doctors? Is that a generally accepted, medically generally accepted statement then?
It would be if they're honest about the evidence, yes.
Fair enough. Now, okay, so let's turn the conversation a little bit. And cannabis, you also mentioned that, if I'm not mistaken, that certain elements of cannabis aren't actually necessarily addictive, because addiction is a key thing. Is cannabis more addictive than other painkillers, the opioids and such like, or where does it stand in the spectrum of that? Because addiction is often heard politically as being something that people say, well, people will get addicted to it and then they can't get off it.
Right.
So where do we stand on the addiction spectrum with respect to cannabis?
Sure. Well, it is true to say that there are some people who use cannabis to excess and find it difficult to control. However, that number is very low in compared to other drugs, and absolutely in the case of the opioids. Something like about 30% of people who ever try heroin will become hooked. With cannabis, the number that is floated by government agencies in the United States is 9%. But we have to take that in context. That 9% includes a majority of people who are forced into treatment as an alternative to incarceration for possession or whatever drug crime they were arrested for in relation to cannabis. So the number is certainly under 9%. And again, some of this is related to the kinds of cannabis that are available. If there is a drug abuse liability, a tendency towards dependency from cannabis that's related to a higher THC content. And as I've already mentioned, THC is not the only therapeutic component of cannabis. And actually, cannabidiol that I mentioned earlier has strong anti-addictive properties that may be used to treat addiction to other substances. And there are other components in cannabis, such as caryophyllene, that also share this ability through even different mechanisms. So we are talking about a complex combination of ingredients that can be optimized through good selective breeding to create more therapeutic effects and lower the already relatively low risks of cannabis as medicine.
Let me ask a question related to this. Does cannabis have different properties? There's a context to this, which is this movement for organic everything that people seem to be focused on. Does cannabis have different properties depending on whether it is grown or produced synthetically in laboratories versus whether it is produced and grown in the wild through leaf structures? Are there any differences in that? What are the implications of those two things?
Well, again, it's very much affected by the growing conditions, but generally speaking, genetics are more important than the environment. The environment can be used to ruin things. It can also be used to slightly enhance things, but the most critical component are the genetics of a particular cannabis chemovar or chemical variety. These are often called strains, although that term is inaccurate. So if a company or a country is embarking on a medicinal cannabis program, they'd be well advised to try to obtain the best genetics that they could and have people who know how to do this selectively breed them for certain attributes, such as the ability to treat pain, and do so with minimal side effects, again, based on the composition of the material.
That makes sense. So I understand that. Let me sort of turn the conversation a little bit into the recreational use. We only have a couple of minutes left in the first half of the show, but when we've talked about the medicinal uses of it, from a recreational perspective, if people add it to certain things that they consume, whether it be drinks or just consume it in other ways, is that any more dangerous than other things today that are legalized in terms of whether it be cigarettes or sugar content? We always hear about that now as being a danger, or indeed alcohol. Where does it rate on the scale of danger from a recreational perspective?
It's far less dangerous than alcohol, and that's borne out by mortality figures. The relationship of alcohol to accidents and premature death is totally compelling. No one has ever died as a direct toxic effect of cannabis. Unlike the opioids, which cause cessation of breathing, there's no dose of cannabis that can do that. We do not have cannabinoid receptors in the part of the brain that affects breathing, so it's much less dangerous. I would emphasize, however, that cannabis should not be lightly combined with alcohol. There is always the possibility of greater impairment and accidents under those conditions, so that is something to be avoided. However, cannabis actually combines very well with other medicines. In the development programs in which I was involved, we never found a drug that could not be used concomitantly with cannabis because of drug-drug interactions. So it is very safe in that regard as well.
Look, Ethan, this has been an absolutely fascinating introduction to the industry. I've realised from listening to you that there's an awful lot more I need to learn in order to better understand it. But I sincerely appreciate you taking the time this morning, getting up ever so early, and joining us and giving us your expert opinion, and sincerely your expert opinion with all the credentials that you have on this subject. And very much look forward, as this industry evolves and the licensing and legislation of it evolves, perhaps we could have you back on our show to discuss in more detail some of the attributes of it. So thank you very much.
I'd be delighted to return. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we're going to take a quick 2-minute break and then be joined afterwards by Simon Ecclesfield. Welcome back. In the second half of today's show, we are going to continue our conversation on the cannabis industry, but switch gears and delve into some of the ways investors can invest in this industry. We're joined in this segment of the show by Simon Ecclesfield. Welcome back to the show, Simon.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon.
Now, before we delve into specific investment ideas, it's disclaimer and warning time. The ideas and thoughts that we mention here today are purely speculative and are mentioned in order to give you, our listeners, ideas and thoughts with respect to one specific industry, not your whole portfolio assessment. We really don't want anyone listening to rush off to their broker after this and trade some security just because we've talked about it. Everyone needs to do his or her own individual research, and just because we mention something, it doesn't mean it's going to go up in value. Anything we mention could go down and lose a lot of money for you. So you really do need to be careful, and you really do need to do your own research. I think that's probably end of the health warnings and disclaimers. So let's get on, Simon, with the legal stuff out of the way. Let's get into the meat of the conversation. Tell us your research on the cannabis industry from an investor or from investment research and a trading perspective. What have you found about it? What do you know about this industry?
Well, that was pretty enlightening, what we heard from Ethan. What I've sort of learned over the last few days by doing some work on it is that marijuana is still illegal in the federal government, in the federal government's eyes in the United States. And as a result of that, any sort of investing, and this is where I love the use of the words health warning that you just came up with, is there are an awful lot of things and factors that you have to take into account. It's illegal at the federal level. It is approved within state level, but within those state levels where it is approved, it is still illegal in the government's eyes. On the 23rd of Feb, the White House press secretary, Sean Spicer, who I don't have a lot of time
soon to be ex-press secretary,
exactly.
Presumably.
Soon to be ex-press secretary, he hinted at greater enforcement by the federal government on recreational cannabis at the state level. The last thing is that it's very, very, very difficult for recreational companies, as opposed to the medical, to set up bank accounts, for example, because banks themselves are extremely nervous of the federal implications. The last thing that's interesting is that it's expected to be fully legalized in Canada by mid-next year, although there is a question of branding there, because it sounds like the government's just going to try and take control of it.
Well, they do that, in fact, in Canada with the alcohol industry. It's
exactly.
Generally speaking, it's a government monopoly. I think it's also worth saying that anybody who is thinking of importing cannabis into Cayman needs to bear in mind it's illegal from a recreational perspective still in Cayman. And if you're listening to this on a podcast in a year or so, maybe that will have changed, but it hasn't as at the date that we air. So I would caution you from rushing off to Canada, getting a few bags of the stuff and bringing it back in. That might get you into some trouble with the RCIPS. So with that said, let's get on. Let's talk about companies and investing in this. When in the research you've done then, how do you go about finding companies that are actually dealing, perhaps the wrong word, actually involved in this industry?
The first thing I did is look at known indices. And I found a couple, which I'll give you some...
Let's just talk, what is an index?
An index is a collection of stocks that is weighted according to the market cap or other factors of those stocks. And as a result of the calculations, you get a movement to the index by movements in the underlying stocks.
Got you. So it's a weighted average of all the companies within it.
That is correct.
Right.
So I found two that are effectively medical marijuana indices. The first one is called the Viridian Capital Cannabis Stock Index, which has not been going that long, since October 2016, according to my research. You can find that at I beg your pardon, start that again, VIRIDIANCA.com.
So, and the reason we say that is, if you're looking to find stocks in this industry, if you go to where the index is, it's got a collection of companies in it. Therefore, look at the index and you'll find out what's underneath it, presumably.
Yes. Second index is Solactive. You can find that SOLACTIVE.com. And that is, again, medical, and seems to be the one that future ETFs on the subject are going to use as their tracker. And the third index, which is probably my favorite, because this one actually deals with all the marijuana stocks, is called the North American Marijuana Index, surprisingly. That you can find at marijuanaindex.com.
Probably don't search for that in your office account, and do that when you're at home. It would be my second warning or third warning of the day.
Just going on from that, that particular index, the third index, in September last year, the 1st of September, it was at 68.8 was the level. It hit a high of 165.9, so almost tripled, I beg your pardon, and it's currently at 120, so it's down about a quarter from where it was. The largest stock in that index has a market cap of 2.61 billion. And the smallest stock has a market cap of 15.96 billion.
I was hoping to get through today's show without ever using any terrible puns, but you've already said it hit a high. So thank you for that. But what we're saying there is that there are a number of companies that are in this space, and generally over the last couple of years, companies in this space who are involved in medical or other marijuana cannabis products have seen their share prices go up in value. That's the gist of what we're talking about here.
Yes, I think we've seen a lot of pressure on the stocks themselves since that commentary from Sean Spicer that I referred to earlier. But yes, they had a very significant run up from June, July last year to current levels.
So one might make the argument, if they've seen this correction because of something that the Trump administration is looking to do, if you look through that and you say, okay, over the next 10 years, given what the doctor's saying, this seems like a no-brainer from a medical perspective, perhaps it's a weaker time to invest because stocks have gone down, but actually potentially an opportunity.
Yes, I totally agree. Just on that, I'll bump into a couple of stocks, and actually I'm going to play off what Ethan ran. First of all, he mentioned Sativex, which is effectively a drug that's been approved in 29 countries. That is actually produced by a company called GW Pharma, which I've mentioned on this show in the past. GW Pharma is effectively the largest stock in the index by a significant multiple. It's got 2.61 million market cap.
Billion, I think.
Billion, I beg your pardon, thank you. But just to give you an idea of the risks that can be associated with it, the stock is down 11% over the last month. It's down 20% over the last 6 months, but it is up 35% over the last 12 months.
And just by way of avoiding any potential conflict of interest, Ethan isn't with us at the moment, but Ethan actually was involved as a consultant to GW Pharma. We haven't coordinated with Ethan with respect to Simon's research. That was independently done, but it should just be noted that he was involved with GW in some of their scientific research.
And just following through on the stock angle, as I mentioned, GW Pharma is the largest by a significant factor. There is an ETF, which is an exchange-traded fund that is actually traded in Canada. The ticker is HMMJ, which runs assets of about $118 million. As of yesterday, the last price was about $9.59, which was up 10 cents on the day, which is about 1%. The volume in it was 70,000 odd shares, and there is a very, very real liquidity issue for some of these ETFs and these in terms of investing in stocks, because when the largest one is 2.6 billion and the smallest one is 15 million, there's a huge weighting towards the larger stocks.
And what you're saying there, I suppose, is as an investor, if you invest in the index and you think, oh, I'm getting exposure to all these companies, you are, but you're actually getting the response of the biggest rather than the response of the smallest, mostly.
That is correct. So that takes us on to the next part, which is where I mentioned that my favourite index is the one that tracks all the stocks, and that tends to throw out some other stocks that can help out. I'll just run them through on market cap. A very famous one, it's called WEED, is the ticker, WEED, which is Canopy Growth. That's got a market cap of 1.36 billion. There's Aurora Cannabis, which is ACB, which is a market cap of 836 million. Aphria, APHRIA, the ticker APH, market cap of 835 million. And then fifth in line is Axim Biotech, and the ticker there is AXIM, market cap about 400 million.
And then those are some of the more recreationally focused stocks.
These are all actually medicinal.
They're all medicinal.
Yeah, these are the ones that you'll find in medicinal base. But I do have, I haven't picked on any recreational ones because they tend to be much more dangerous.
What do you mean by more dangerous?
Well, just purely the commentary from Mr. Spicer has affected those stocks significantly. They're all down about 50% since about February. I know, I've got a couple PA.
Okay.
Now that brings me to another stock, and again, this is referencing what Ethan said earlier on, where he mentioned that later on this year, he expects that there's a drug going to be approved for epilepsy. Having done all this wonderful research, I think I know the stock that it is. It is a stock called Zogenix.
Well, we think it's a stock. You think it's a stock?
I think. We're going to have to clear this with Ethan to see if it's the one, but it's a stock called Zogenix. The ticker is ZGNX, market cap about 300 million. It's up about 35% over the last 12 months. It's trading near the highs. The high has been 13.7. Last I saw, it was 12.75. They've just enrolled their last patient in phase 3 trials for a drug called ZX008, which is for the treatment of children and young adults who suffer from epilepsy.
Interesting.
So that is one that might be a flyer.
So a flyer, when we say flyer, these are stocks for people who can afford to lose 95, 99%.
You could lose 100%.
You could lose 100%. So we'll perhaps end that conversation. We are, as always on this show, we are running out of time, but it is important, anyone listening to this, just because it's possible this company may see an approval for one of its drugs, doesn't mean it's certain to do. And in fact, it may mean, and often in the drug industry, you find an approval can lead often 3-6 months later to something going wrong, and then actually the whole house of cards falling down on you. So you've got to be super careful whenever you're investing in drugs, in the drug industry, and specifically in an area of the drug industry which is subject to certain additional pressures, shall we say.
Absolutely.
Now, Simon, I sincerely appreciate you joining us. Our time is up, but thank you again for spending some time with us this morning.
And thank you for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure. As a final note then, before we leave, I do wish to thank you all for listening and joining us this morning, and remind you that today's show can and will be able to be heard as a podcast on the CFA Society Cayman Islands webpage, and encourage anyone who has a question or topic that they wish us to cover to email us at moneysense@candw.ky, or for those who understand what Twitter is, which often doesn't include me, tweet us or Twitter us or whatever it is at Money Sense Radio. If you want to get a conversation started about stock ideas in this space, we will perhaps try and persuade Simon Ecclesfield to learn Twitter as well. That will be two Simons who will be new to it.
That could be hard.
Yes. Anyway, be sure to follow and join us and post any questions or comments there. We will reply to you. With that, thank you once again. Goodbye, and please do join in and listen